My motion is specifically looking at the issue of knife crime and and possession of knives, and the laws that were placed or passed in this House last year, and specifically calling for an inquiry to look into why so few custodial sentences have been actually issued by the judiciary, and to essentially have a brief inquiry by the Law and Justice Committee to determine how the legislation, or how effective the legislation has been, what are the impediments with respect to why the judiciary, what appears to be not so keen to hand out the custodial sentences, and whether the fines are instead being used, or whether sentences being suspended, for example. But essentially, we know we've had a very difficult couple of weeks in New South Wales when it comes to knife crime. The tragic and horrific incident, of course, at Bondi Junction that saw 6 people being killed and 12 injured after a knife attack. 2 days later, we've had Bishop Murray Emanuel and Father Isaac Royale, who were allegedly stabbed by a knife-wielding teenager at the Syrian Christ the Good Shepherd Church in Wakeley. And of course, as we now know, it's been reported the bishop has lost his eyesight in one of his eyes. Most recently, there have been reports of 2 other knife instances just this weekend, one being at Western Sydney School in St Mary's, which went into lockdown after a 13-year-old student allegedly produced a knife, and secondly, on Friday, the 10th of May, and across the weekend, a 16-year-old boy was allegedly attacked in Dubbo, with further threats of knife attacks at the same incident. And these aren't the only recent tragedies caused by knife crime. On the 26th of April, a 16-year-old boy died after being stabbed in Narromine West at Dubbo. A 26-year-old man has been charged with that murder. Last week, 2 weeks ago, a 10-year-old girl was allegedly stabbed to death by her 17-year-old sister. And the 17-year-old has since been charged with murder. 3 days later, 22-year-old Kai Schaefer, a young surfer described as a big heart with a big smile, was found with multiple stab wounds in the car park of a beach in Coffs Harbour. He too tragically died of his injuries. So it's clear, Assistant President, that it's clear that New South Wales is facing a potential growing epidemic of knife crime, and we need to nip it in the bud. And certainly this was the intention of the House last year, where the vast majority of people, both the government and the opposition and many on the crossbench, passed the legislation, Amendment Knives Crime Bill of 2023, and the legislation doubled the penalties for knife crime offences, raising the maximum penalty for possessing a knife in a public place or school to 4 years in prison, or a $4,400 fine, or both. And indeed, there are other penalties that were doubled, and of course, the offences moved from the Summary Offence Act to the Crimes Act. Now, at the first reading of the bill last year, the New South Wales Attorney-General at that stage stated, and I quote, "The government is acting to address the understandable community concern, given the very high-profile tragic events involving knives that we have seen in New South Wales over the past year. People who are in public places or schools should not be exposed to harm of any kind. And these dangers caused by the possession or use of knives is unacceptable, and the penalties must reflect the seriousness and the gravity of the harm caused." Well, I agree with the statement made by the Attorney-General last year, and I think if there's ever a time where that statement is even more relevant, it's now, given there have been so many more knife crimes since this legislation was passed. I think it's imperative that this Parliament understand why the reasoning behind this type of lack of custodial sentences. And I'm calling on the Parliament and this House to support a very brief inquiry, to speak to the relevant stakeholders to understand what the decisions are behind the type of sentencing that's been imposed or not imposed in this case. President, and I thank all the members for their contribution to the debate. I want to particularly note what the Honourable Rod Roberts has said, and I thank him as a former police officer for his contribution. In particular, I think the Honourable Member is quite right in saying that these fines are not a deterrent the types of crimes that we've been witnessing across the last year, and specifically in the last few months. I think it's also worthy to note that it'd be interesting to see how many of these fines are actually paid and how many are forfeited. Can I also acknowledge and thank the Honourable Susan Carter for her contribution, and rightly a member has stated that the view of the Sentencing Council did not matter to the government last year when they introduced this legislation. And in fact, they didn't seek any counsel from the Sentencing Council whatsoever in bringing this legislation forward. And the reason for that is because it came through the Premier's office rather than the Attorney-General. The Premier at the time knew that action was needed. He knew that action was absolutely warranted at the time, and it's imperative that we understand as a parliament how that legislation now is playing out within the judiciary. Now, I note the concern is that, of course, that the Sentencing Council will, and this is the reason the government's giving for why they're not supporting this motion, is they're waiting for the Sentencing Council, a review that started under the former government. They're apparently waiting for their review. Well, that's nonsense. They will bring legislation forward when they see fit, and they won't be waiting for the Sentencing Council whatsoever. And in fact, the Sentencing Council would be welcome to make a contribution or a submission should this inquiry go ahead with the Law and Justice Committee. Can I also make a point to what the government member has said earlier here in the debate? The idea that the Sentencing Council has professionals, well, I would say that there are many professionals on the Law and on the Standing Committee of Law and Justice, and it's in fact quite offensive to suggest otherwise. There are former police officers, lawyers, barristers, people that are quite in a position, and experienced politicians as well, including the chair, who's been a member of this House for many, many years, who would be very capable of making a very good contribution and a thorough inquiry into the exact point that I'm asking, and that is that it is imperative to understand that when we make legislation in this place, as we did last year, which was quite significant, that we do need to be confident that the judiciary is actually understanding what the parliament wanted to see come through that legislation. It does concern me the spate of crime, and I think if you want to stop some of this crime, if you want to stop young people from carrying knives, you start actually giving out custodial sentences.